Bienvenidos al canal de YouTube de Ediciones Radio. Aquí encontrarás vídeos especializados en cada tema. Si te gusta nuestro contenido, no olvides suscribirte, darle a me gusta y comentar tu experiencia. Gracias por elegirnos en tu camino hacia el éxito.
Recuerda que todos nuestros temarios también están disponibles en formato digital y papel. Para cualquier duda puedes escribirnos a info@edicionesradio.com. Cuerpo de Maestros. Inglés. Volumen 1.
Main ideas. Good communication is as stimulating as black coffee and just as hard to sleep after. Anne Morrow Lindbergh. Introduction. This topic concentrates on non-verbal communication and its development, what has often been the focus of attention in areas such as the developing social skills or the improvement of certain skills. Verbal and non-verbal communication are directly related to the communicative approach, which maintains that language learning consists of knowing how to communicate and produce communication in a meaningful way. According to the references of Curriculum on Communication, we must mention that, for example, through the Crown Decree 157/2022 of March 1, which establishes the organization and minimum teachings of primary education, in Annex 2, Foreign Language, it is highlighted that the area of foreign language in the primary education stage has as its main objective the acquisition of basic communicative competence in the foreign language. In the mentioned Crown Decree 157/2022, Annex 2, it highlights in the specific Competence 1 for the foreign language area that among the most useful comprehension strategies for students are non-verbal language, images, repetition or rereading. In addition, in specific Competence 2, it states that the strategies that allow the improvement of production, both formal and informal, in primary education include, among others, planning and compensation through verbal and non-verbal language. 1. Communication in the foreign language classroom. All living creatures have some means of transmitting information among their kind, because communication is essential to be able to survive. Some creatures use vocalic and consonantal sounds, others physical movement or facial expressions. The human being is able to dominate a great variety of communication techniques, the emission of sound, body language to make gestures or facial expression. Communication is the process of exchanging information, and communication studies is the discipline focused on communication forms, processes and meanings, including speech, interpersonal and organizational communication. Mass communication is a more specialized discipline focused on the institutions, practice and effects of journalism, broadcasting, advertising, public relations, and other mediated communication directed at a large, undifferentiated or segmented audience. When talking about human communication, the sharing of knowledge and experiences, the giving or receiving of orders and cooperation, among others, must be taken into account. Common forms of human communication include sign language, speaking, writing, gestures, and broadcasting. Communication can be interactive, transactive. Transactive communication occurs when sources transmit messages to one another simultaneously, intentional or unintentional. Besides, it can be verbal or non-verbal. Surprisingly, only 7 to 11% of all communication is verbal. The rest can be considered non-verbal, including different aspects. Communication varies considerably in form and style. Internal communication, within oneself, is intrapersonal, while communication between two individuals is interpersonal. Interpersonal communication, in the form of conversation, plays an important role in ESL. There are a number of theories of communication that attempt to explain human communication, and several theories relating to human communication draw upon different philosophies. One of the most famous communication models can be seen in the work of Roman Jakobson. 6 elements and their correlative functions make this model up. Code. It is an arbitrary, limited, and rather extensive mixture of signs and signals. These are combined by the sender and the receiver following previously established rules. Contact. It is the means by which the signs and signals are transmitted. The message goes through this channel, e.g. the air, in a face-to-face conversation between speaker and listener, or the wire when talking on the phone. Addresser. It can be an instrument, an animal, or a person. The message will be codified, and the convenient signals will be chosen. Addressee. The person who decodifies or interprets the received message. Message. The contents or the information the addresser sends to the addressee. Context. The situation in which the addresser and the addressee are. It often allows us a correct interpretation of the message. There are communication barriers, such as anxiety. When associated with communication, it is known as communication apprehension, approximately equals interruption. Such anxiety is usually influenced by one's self-concept. Besides apprehension, communication can be impaired via misunderstanding, indiscrimination, or polarization. Failing to share a common language is also a significant barrier in many parts of the world. Apart from that, there may be following barriers in communication. Language dialect. Time lag. An interval of time between two related phenomena as a cause and its effect. Politics, such as wars. Physical, such as background noise. Emotional. In modern life, telecommunications, use of technology to aid and enhance distance communications, gain great importance. On the one hand, we can find digital telecommunications like voice processing systems or digital telephones. Besides, digital transmission media, including telegraphy and computer network, can be taken into account, and on the other hand, there are analog telecommunications like radio, TV, or photography. 1.1. Communicative competence. Communication in general involves enabling someone to understand what someone else wants to tell him or her. Besides communicating facts, we can communicate opinions and emotions. Another possibility is to try to amuse, entertain, or distract the partner by communicating. In general, communication involves an audience. In the case of one-way spoken communication such as radio broadcast, the audience can be referred to as listeners only, whereas in face-to-face conversation, the role of listener and speaker will be in continuous change. Communication in the foreign language classroom is strongly related to communicative competence. Language teaching nowadays is mainly based on the idea that the goal of language acquisition is communicative competence, the ability to use the language correctly and appropriately to achieve communication goals. The desired final result of the language learning process is the ability to communicate competently, not the ability to use the language as a native speaker does. The Organic Law 3/2020 BO, of the 29th of December 2020, henceforth LOMLOE, amending the Organic Law of Education to 2006, in its preamble, underlines the importance of development of communicative competence. In the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, the CEFR, language use comprises the actions performed by persons who, as individuals and social agents, develop a range of communicative language competencies. In this way, communicative competence is made up of 4 sub-competencies, although sometimes socio-cultural competence is added as a 5th sub-competence: linguistic, socio-linguistic, discourse, and strategic. Linguistic competence is knowing how to use the grammar, syntax, and vocabulary of a language. Linguistic competence asks, what words do I use? How do I put them into phrases and sentences? Socio-linguistic competence is knowing how to use and respond to language appropriately, given the setting, the topic, and the relationships among the people communicating. Socio-linguistic competence asks, which words and phrases fit this setting and this topic? How can I express a specific attitude, courtesy, authority, friendliness, respect, when I need to? How do I know what attitude another person is expressing? Discourse competence is knowing how to interpret the larger context and how to construct longer stretches of language so that the parts make up a coherent whole. Discourse competence asks, how are words, phrases, and sentences put together to create conversations, speeches, email messages, or newspaper articles? Strategic competence is knowing how to recognize and repair communication breakdowns, how to work around gaps in one's knowledge of the language, and how to learn more about the language and in the context. Strategic competence asks, how do I know when I have misunderstood or when someone has misunderstood me? What do I say then? How can I express my ideas if I do not know the name of something or the right verb form to use? Socio-cultural competence, or ability to familiarize with the social and cultural context in which the foreign language is spoken. In the early stages of language learning, teachers and students may want to keep in mind the goal of communicative efficiency, that learners should be able to make themselves understood, using their current proficiency to the fullest. They should try to avoid confusion in the message, due to faulty pronunciation, grammar, or vocabulary, to avoid offending communication partners due to socially inappropriate style, and to use strategies for recognizing and managing communication breakdowns. Thus, the main aim of the area of foreign language teaching in primary education is to learn to communicate in the foreign language, favoring at the same time its instrumental usage. This implies, on the other hand, adopting an approach based on communication and the progressive development of communicative competence. It refers to oral and written, receptive and productive messages which have to be worked on integrated (ly) in the same way as they take place in real life. Although receptive skills are usually developed more when learning a foreign language, it is necessary to practice productive skills sufficiently to enable students to produce messages fluently and correctly. Besides, the production of contextualized messages offers possibilities to check the communicative efficiency of the elaborated learning. The EFL classroom is a place where students develop communicative competence. Often, this is seen as helping the learner approximate the phonetic, morphological, and syntactic patterns of the language by means of pattern practice and similar drills. But there is more: the acquisition of communicative competence. One method recommended for different levels of foreign language teaching in Europe is stated in the Common European Framework of Reference, the CEFR. It is called an action-oriented approach, and it is used to help students develop communicative competence through the performance of tasks or activities that focus on critical thinking, such as argumentation. Traditionally, from the educative point of view, oral language was considered less important than written language, because oral language would be acquired automatically by the child. It is not until 1970 that new pedagogic orientations give priority to oral language with the aim to speak well and to be able to listen comprehensibly. There are a lot of reasons for the importance of oral language. Human language is mainly oral. From the historic point of view, written language is secondary. Within human language, oral language is the daily, vital and permanent means of communication. Great part of human communication is oral. Therefore, oral language has taken root in all statements of effective, social, and intellectual human life. The command of oral language is fundamental for the later acquisition of written language. Mistakes in oral communication, poverty of vocabulary, syntactic mistakes or bad articulation will influence written expression. Oral language may be divided into verbal, oral, spoken, and non-verbal communication. 1.2. Verbal communication. Traditionally, verbal communication refers to spoken language rather than to written language. There is no question that the development of oral language skills for second as well as first language learners is of great importance. Language learners must focus on oral language proficiency because it is eventually the skill that they will most use. Indeed, oral language interactions make up the main part of our day-to-day communications, remaining the primary form of discourse throughout the world. But oral discourse in second language learners does not develop in a vacuum. It is related with the other language skills, reading, writing, and listening. In addition, by the time students are studying a second language, they have already developed literacy skills that we also wish to develop in the target language. One of the main goals for ESL, to acquire communicative competence, implies two-way communication in which oral ear and oral mouth language both play an important role. Oral language development needs two essential elements: comprehensible input and social interaction. The language learning environment, that is the classroom, should be structured to include input as well as encourage the two-way communication by social interaction. 1.2.1 Characteristics of oral or verbal language. It is more complex to teach oral language than to teach written language, as we have to add the special difficulties of the oral code to the general ones. Thus, we need a specific methodology and treatment. In oral language, we have to treat phonic and prosodic features of speech, rhythm and intonation, which depend on a complex system of phonation and hearing. The application of written language allows us to plan and organize the communicative act, to take care of different aspects, and to correct the final result. Oral language is produced quickly and automatically, thus the learning process for its application is more complicated. Oral communication is more complex because the interlocutor is directly present, and by listening, accepting, denying, sharing or disagreeing, he has direct influence on the other interlocutor. Thus, oral communication will always be more subjective as it is full of effective interferences which depend on the speaker and the listener. The efficiency of communication will depend mainly on the transmitter's and receiver's self-confidence and personality, as well as effective features like friendliness, respect, or aggressiveness. 1.2.2 Aspects and development of oral or verbal language. According to Linfers, oral language is a complex system that relates sounds to meanings and is made up of three components: the phonological, the semantic, and the syntactic one. The phonological component involves the rules for combining sounds. Speakers of English, for example, know that an English word can end, but not begin with an ng sound. Native speakers are not aware of these rules, but their ability to understand and pronounce English words demonstrates that they do know an enormous number of rules. The semantic component is made up of morphemes, the smallest units of meaning that may be combined with each other to make up words, e.g. book plus s are the two morphemes that make up books, and sentences as Brown described. A dictionary contains the semantic component of a language, but also dictates which words and meanings are important for the speakers of a language. The syntactic component consists of the rules that enable people to combine morphemes into sentences. As soon as a child uses two morphemes together, like in like sweets, it is using a syntactic rule about how to combine morphemes to express oneself meaningfully. Like all the rules for the production of language, syntactic rules become increasingly complex as the child improves speech. From combining two morphemes, the child goes on to combine words with suffixes or inflections, s or ing, e.g. books and playing, and eventually creates questions, statements, commands, etc. It also learns to combine two ideas into one complex sentence, like in I'll give you my ball if you give me sweets. In social situations, speakers of a language use these three components together. Some linguists might add a fourth component, pragmatics, which explains the rules of language use. Pragmatic rules are one part of a person's communicative competence, the ability to speak appropriately in different situations, e.g. informally at home or more formally at work. Young children need to learn the ways of speaking in the kindergarten or at school, where, for instance, teachers often ask rhetorical questions. Learning pragmatic rules is as important as learning the rules of the other components of language, as people are judged depending on what they say and when they say it. The development of oral language is one of the child's most natural and impressive accomplishments. Almost all children learn the rules of their language at an early age through use, and over time, without formal instruction. Human beings are born to speak. They have an innate gift for finding out the rules of the language used in their environment. The environment itself is also a significant factor. Children learn the specific variety of the language, dialect, that the people around them speak. Children do not, however, learn only by imitating the ones who are around them. We know that children work out proper linguistic rules because they use forms that adults never use, such as I seed mum or I see your tooths. Children learn the conventional forms, saw and teeth, as they find out the exceptions to the rules of English syntax. Like learning to walk, learning to talk requires time for development and practice in everyday situations. Constant correction of a child's speech is usually unproductive and demotivating. In conclusion, language occurs through an interaction among people, environment, and the children's own thinking abilities. It is difficult to state the exact moment when children develop these abilities. In general, children say their first words between 12 and 18 months of age. They begin to use complex sentences by the age of 4 to 4.5 years. By the time they start kindergarten, children know most of the basics of their language, so that they are able to communicate easily with someone who speaks as they do, uses their dialect. As with other aspects of development, you cannot predict language acquisition. One child may say its first word at 10 months, another at 20 months. One child may utter complex sentences at 5.5 years, another at 3 years. 1.2.3 Main forms and techniques of oral or verbal communication. There are two big groups of techniques and activities to practice communication. Practice of dialogues, conversation, role-play, survey, interview, dramatization, brainstorming, etc. Practice of monologues, narration, explanation and oral description, reading dialogues aloud, etc. In the following, we are going to have a closer look at some of them. A conversation. In oral communication, the term conversation refers to the continuous exchange of the roles of speaker and listener. Free or spontaneous conversation. It is the most frequent form of spoken language, which refers to an informal and spontaneous exchange of opinions and ideas about a topic. Although it is considered the most motivating activity for students, it seems a bit difficult to accomplish with primary pupils in the foreign language. Discussion or polemic conversation. In this kind of conversation, different points of view are confronted. The participants are meant to come to an agreement. The pupil's behavior gains importance in this kind of activities, as the discussion should not be considered a fight to see who wins, but a preparation for living in democracy. The topics can be related to everyday situations at school or to topical issues. Due to the complexity of this task, it should be carried out in the last grade. B. Dramatization. This is a very complex form of dialogue, as it does not only include oral expression, but also gestures and body language. Apart from being very motivating, you practice expression, dialogue, verbal fluency, imagination, and creativity. C. Interview and survey. They are forms of dialogue that are directed towards the search for information. One interlocutor asks, and the other answers. The success of these activities depends on the kind of questions asked to obtain the desired information. When planning the activity, you should keep the pupils' ages and interests in mind. D. Exposition or explanation. While exposing, the interlocutor is trying to explain something to the listeners. In comparison with the dialogue, an exposition has to be well organized and show linguistic fluency so as to maintain the listener's attention. E. Telephone conversation. Maybe this is the form of oral communication which is nearest to the student's immediate interests and needs. To have a successful conversation on the phone, there are some points of view to be kept in mind. Firstly, we should be aware of the fact that in this case the basic instrument of transmission is the voice. It substitutes any gesture we could take advantage of in a face-to-face conversation. This voice may transmit feelings and impressions like sincerity, confidence, and enthusiasm. Therefore, it is important for the pupil to learn how to take care of the tone of voice, rhythm, and pronunciation. Above all, it is convenient to teach them to speak slowly so that the interlocutor will be able to decipher the message. In the classroom, you can use a DIY telephone so as to make the situation as real as possible and the pupils really become aware of the fact that it is not so easy to understand your partner if you do not see him, her, or know exactly what the message is about. Secondly, the comprehension of the message is also influenced by the linguistic items used. These should be easy, presented in short sentences, and the linguistic and structural contents should be adapted to our pupils' knowledge. Another element to be included, step by step, is the attitude shown when telephoning. What we really want to achieve is that our students do not feel scared or shy when they have to use L2 on the phone. Their attitude ought to be positive, showing interest in what is communicated by the interlocutor, above all when information is asked for. The latter will be the most frequently used issue when applying oral communication in primary education. 1.3. Non-verbal communication. The major categories of non-verbal communication include the following: personal space, eye contact, position, posture, paralanguage, expression, gesture, touch, locomotion, pacing, adornment, context, physiologic responses. 1.3.1. The importance of nonverbal communication. The way something is expressed may carry more significance and weight than the words themselves. Accompanied by a smile or a frown, said with a loud or a gentle voice, the contents of our communications are framed by our perceptions of their context. In schools, at home and at workplaces, the elements of nonverbal communication are often underestimated and not paid enough attention. 1.3.2. Categories of nonverbal communication. Personal space. This category refers to the distance which people feel comfortable approaching others or having others approach them. People from certain countries often feel uncomfortable standing closer to each other, while people of Southern European descent tend to prefer a relatively smaller distance. Different distances are also intuitively assigned for situations involving intimate relations, ordinary personal relationships, e.g. friends, social relations, e.g. co-workers, or in public places, e.g. in parks, restaurants, or on the street. Eye contact. This is a very rich dimension. Eye contact modifies the meaning of other non-verbal behaviors. Eye contact can have a very significant influence when you are interacting with people. It can play a key role in helping to establishing relationship, and failing to make eye contact in many cultures is associated with being dishonest or having something to hide. Eye contact also plays an important role in turn-taking during conversation. Among a group of people, a speaker will often make eye contact with the person he wants a response from. Someone who wants to enter or interject in a conversation will catch the eye of the person speaking to indicate that he wants to interrupt, and equally someone who no longer wants to listen will avoid eye contact. People who know each other well can communicate mutual understanding with a single look. Eye contact is also a way of communicating attraction. Position. Together with the distance between people and the angle of eye contact, it can be included in a more general category of proxemics, the study of spatial distances between individuals in different cultures and situations. Posture. A person's body communicates a rich variety of messages. Posture can communicate a number of things. Posture can convey a whole range of attitudes, from interest or the lack of it, to degrees of respect or subordination. Speakers often use posture to punctuate what they are saying, e.g., shifting forward in their seat or leaning in towards their interlocutor to punctuate an important point. Paralanguage. Non-lexical, vocal communications may be considered a type of non-verbal communication in its broadest sense, as it can suggest many emotional nuances. This category includes a number of subcategories. Hollow right-pointing triangle inflection, rising, falling, flat. Hollow right-pointing triangle pacing, rapid, slow, measured, changing. Hollow right-pointing triangle intensity, loud, soft, breathy. Hollow right-pointing triangle tone, nasal, whining. Hollow right-pointing triangle pitch, high, medium, low, changes. Hollow right-pointing triangle pauses, meaningful, disorganized, shy, hesitant. Facial expression. The face is more highly developed as an organ of expression in humans than any other living being. Some facial expressions become quite habitual, almost fixed into the muscular structure of the face, and may create a characteristic appearance. Gesture. There are many kinds of gestures. Gesture can be used to replace verbal communication. Different finger, thumb or hand gestures can convey a range of meanings in different cultures, from insults to approval or even attraction. Many good speakers or storytellers use hand gestures to illustrate their stories. It can also form part of punctuation with head nods and hand movements, which relate to the stress, rhythm, and tempo of sentences. Speakers who use their hands a lot often let them drop at the end of a sentence. Heads often nod down when words in sentences are stressed. One of the most obvious, and in many ways useful gestures, is pointing. It's over there. I want that one. Gestures, too, have many different meanings in different cultures, and what may be friendly in one country or region can be an insult in another. Touch. How one person touches another communicates a great deal of information. A grip may be gentle or firm, and one may hold the other person on the back of the upper arm, on the shoulder, or in the middle of the back. People have different areas of personal intimacy. Many adolescents are particularly sensitive to any touching that could be interpreted as patronizing or undue familiarity. Even the angle of one's holding another's hand might suggest a hurrying or obliging implicit attitude, or on the other hand, a respectful, gentle, permission-giving one. Locomotion. The style of physical movement in space also communicates a great deal, as well as affecting the feelings of the person doing the moving. Pacing. This is the way an action is done, for example, nervously. A related variable is the time it takes to react to a stimulus, called latency of response. Some people seem to react to questions, interact in conversations, or are slower or faster in reacting than others. Adornment. Our communications are also affected by a variety of other variables, such as clothes, makeup, and accessories. These offer signals relating to context, e.g., formal versus informal, status, and individuality. The ways people carry glasses also suggest different semiotic meanings. Semiotics is the science of the emotional or psychological impact of signs. 2. Extralinguistic strategies. Extralinguistic strategies may be applied to oral and written language. When reading, for instance, underlining can be considered an extralinguistic strategy. As far as oral language is concerned, These strategies may be influenced by the following aspects. 1. Stephen D. Krashen, Language Acquisition and Language Education, distinguishes between acquisition, the subconscious process, and learning, the conscious knowledge or knowing about languages. With his input hypothesis, Krashen tries to find an answer to the question of how students acquire language. The best hypothesis seems to be that we acquire in just one way, by understanding messages or by obtaining comprehensible input. That means we acquire a new rule by understanding messages that contain this new rule. This is done with the aid of extralinguistic context, knowledge of the world, and our previous linguistic competence. This input hypothesis explains why pictures and other realia are so valuable to the beginning language learner. They provide context and background information that helps make input comprehensible. 2. Communication by using media, telephone, email, in comparison with face-to-face communication, shows that the main differences are that face-to-face communication has immediacy, and it gives you access to extralinguistic cues like facial expression. 3. Extralinguistic cues such as visuals, props, and body language are used in instructional approaches like sheltered English, which try to make academic instruction in English understandable to limited English proficient students. 4. When using academic language, which tends to be context-reduced, language tasks are more difficult for students when extralinguistic cues are unavailable and meanings are encoded exclusively in the words themselves. 5. By the function of language, we mean understanding the dynamics of language as language is used in daily life, work, and academic settings to accomplish the user's ends. This includes the socio-, para-, and extralinguistic dimensions of language, understanding of language varieties, as well as socio-political aspects of how languages are valued, and how their uses can be categorized through their use of language. 6. Many initiator strategies towards listening comprehension include question words, repetitions of the difficult information, and possible interpretations of the previous turn, extralinguistic aids, and didactic roles. 7. From a language acquisition perspective, it can be distinguished between the level of English proficiency required for interpersonal communication and the level required for academic purposes. One important difference is that interpersonal communication is context embedded within extralinguistic cues such as gestures and facial expressions to aid in communication. In contrast, academic language is context-reduced without extralinguistic cues to aid in communication, thus requiring ESL students to be proficient with complex linguistic structures. 8. Extralinguistic variables such as social status, style, ethnicity, and language background may all be contributing factors to the reduction process of pronunciation. Nonverbal reactions to messages in different contexts. As mentioned above, nonverbal communication refers to the fact that about 38% of language is communicated by paralanguage, which is basically the use of the voice. About 55% comes through nonverbal, which includes such things as gesture, posture, facial expression, etc. It is behavior other than spoken or written communication that creates or represents meaning. Feelings and emotional responses are not so much based upon what another person says, but upon what another person does. Nonverbal messages are seen as more reliable. When verbal and nonverbal contradict, we tend to believe the nonverbal. For one thing, it is seen as being more difficult to manipulate. Non-verbal communication is strongly related to verbal communication, as non-verbal cues substitute for, contradict, emphasize, or regulate verbal messages. Non-verbal cues can be ambiguous, because no dictionary can accurately classify them. Their meaning varies, not only by culture and context, but by degree of intention. They are also continuous. It is possible to stop talking, but it is generally impossible to stop non-verbal cues. Non-verbal cues are multi-channel, and everything is happening at once, and therefore it may be confusing to try to keep up with everything. Most of us simply do not do so, at least not consciously. This has both advantages and disadvantages. Because we interpret non-verbal cues subconsciously, it can happen quickly and fairly accurately. However, because it is not conscious and more right-brained, it is difficult to put one's finger on exactly why one got a certain impression from someone, or even to put it into left-brained wording. Non-verbal communication may be divided into 4 broad categories. Physical. This is the personal type of communication. It includes facial expressions, tone of voice, sense of touch, sense of smell, and body motions. Aesthetic. This is the type of communication that takes place through creative expressions, playing instrumental music, dancing, painting, and sculpturing. Signs. This is the mechanical type of communication, which includes the use of signal flags, horns, and sirens. Symbolic. This is the type of communication that makes use of religious, status, or ego-building symbols. Examples of non-verbal reactions to messages in different contexts. 1. Instructions. When we ask our students to do something in class, this action can be considered a non-verbal reaction. They can be asked to color a picture, to move as for example in the game Simon Says, etc. 2. TPR, Total Physical Response. This method, developed by James Asher, is based on the idea of non-verbal reactions. It is a method which motivates pupils a lot, because it usually interrupts classroom routine. 3. Classroom language. It is important for our students to know how we want them to behave in the classroom. That is why we should establish certain rules at the beginning of the school year. These rules will be mainly reflected by classroom language, e.g., open your book, which is another way of non-verbal reactions. The main aim of learning any foreign language, and especially English, must be the ability to use it for communication. This fact is not only underlined by the curriculum, but also by key competencies, linguistic communication, and multilingual competence, which are reflected in the Crown Decree 157/2022 of March 1, Article 9. That is why this topic is of great importance for the future teacher. It is not only relevant due to its relation with Spanish educational laws, but also because all aspects of non-verbal communication are of extreme importance in primary education due to the low communicative competence our pupils have. The older they are, the better they will communicate verbally. Nevertheless, at the beginning of their studies, they will depend extremely on non-verbal communication. 1. Communication in the foreign language classroom. All living creatures have some means of transmitting information among their kind, because communication is essential to be able to survive. Some creatures is vocalic and consonantal sounds, others physical movement or facial expressions. The human being is able to dominate a great variety of communication techniques: the emission of sound, body language to make gestures, facial expression. Communication is the process of exchanging information, and communication studies is the discipline focused on communication forms, processes, and meanings, including speech, interpersonal, and organizational communication. One of the most famous communication models can be seen in the work of Roman Jakobson. 6 elements and their correlative functions make this model up. 1.1. Communicative competence. Communication in the foreign language classroom is strongly related to communicative competence. Language teaching nowadays is mainly based on the idea that the goal of language acquisition is communicative competence, the ability to use the language correctly and appropriately to achieve communication goals. Communicative competence is made up of 4 sub-competencies, although sometimes the socio-cultural competence is added a 5th sub-competence: linguistic, socio-linguistic, discourse, and strategic. Thus, the main aim of the area of foreign language teaching in primary education is to learn to communicate in the foreign language, favoring at the same time its instrumental usage. 1.2. Verbal communication. There is no question that the development of oral language skills for second as well as first language learners is of great importance. Language learners must focus on oral language proficiency because it is eventually the skill that they will most use. Indeed, oral language interactions make up the main part of our day-to-day communications, remaining the primary form of discourse throughout the world. Oral language is a complex system that relates sounds to meanings and is made up of 3 components: the phonological, the semantic, and the syntactic one. In social situations, speakers of a language use these 3 components together. Some linguists might add a 4th component, pragmatics, which explains the rules of language use. There are 2 big groups of techniques and activities to practice communication. Practice of dialogues, conversation, role-play, survey, interview, dramatization, brainstorming, etc. Practice of monologues, narration, explanation and oral description, reading dialogues aloud, etc. The comprehension of the message is also influenced by the linguistic items used. These should be easy, presented in short sentences, and the linguistic and structural contents should be adapted to our pupils' knowledge. 1.3. Non-verbal communication. The major categories of non-verbal communications include the following: personal space, eye contact, position, posture, paralanguage, expression, gesture, touch, locomotion, pacing, adornment, context, physiologic responses. 2. Extralinguistic strategies. Stephen D. Krashen, Language Acquisition and Language Education, distinguishes between acquisition, the subconscious process, and learning, the conscious knowledge or knowing about languages. Face-to-face communication has immediacy, and it gives you access to extralinguistic cues like facial expression. Language tasks are more difficult for students when extralinguistic cues are unavailable and meanings are encoded exclusively in the words themselves. Interpersonal communication is context embedded with extralinguistic cues, such as gestures and facial expressions, to aid in communication. In contrast, academic language is context-reduced without extralinguistic cues to aid in communication. Nonverbal reactions to messages in different contexts. Nonverbal communication is strongly related to verbal communication, as nonverbal cues substitute for, contradict, emphasize, or regulate verbal messages. Nonverbal communication may be divided into 4 broad categories. Physical. This is the personal type of communication. It includes facial expressions, tone of voice, sense of touch, sense of smell, and body motions. Aesthetic. This is the type of communication that takes place through creative expressions, playing instrumental music, dancing, painting, and sculpturing. Signs. This is the mechanical type of communication, which includes the use of signal flags, horns, and sirens. Symbolic. This is the type of communication that makes use of religious, status, or ego-building symbols.